quote from an article by Sheila Jasanoff, which describes the difference or the boundary between, one of the boundaries between law and science. The law develops knowledge as an aid to doing justice in a particular case. By contrast, science seeks truths that are, as far as possible, detachable from their context of production. And this quote, to me, just, again, shows the difference between science and law, but we have to remember, too, that they're very similar. They're both very honored, prestigious institutions in American society, and they're both directed at producing reliable knowledge, at least in the legal context being the courtroom, as distinguished from lawmaking, and both seek to find the truth. But the end uses and applications of this truth are very different, both in scope and context for both law and science. So again, my name is Huang. I'm really excited to share with you my project. It was titled Achieving Scientific Literacy in the Classroom, and the purpose of the project was to develop an integrated climate science and law curriculum for law students. So prior to moving to Tucson, I worked as a policy analyst in DC, where I focused mostly on analyzing the legal implications and consequences of different environmental restoration programs, especially the Chesapeake Bay, and also a lot of water law and water policy issues. And maybe it was just me, but a lot of the times my life felt like this. And I'm not, you could just substitute that with lawyers, or, and it works. But I'm not naive, obviously, enough to think that if you just hand somebody some good science, some relevant science, that good policy will come out from it, right? Because policy will always be made on myriad factors, both relevant, both irrelevant, to the situation at hand. But I do strongly believe that those trade-offs and decisions should be made on an informed basis at the very least, so you know what you're giving up. And in the legal context, I think this is particularly important. A recent study of the 2013 applicants to law school, their self-identified majors, unsurprisingly, were in the humanities and social sciences, so lots of English majors and poli-sci majors, psychology, history, which are all great, but those outnumbered the STEM majors by sometimes orders of magnitude. And even though these were just the applicants, not the folks who eventually went to law school, I think it's very reflective of the final student body population in law schools. And so then you can think, well, they're English majors, probably the last time they had science maybe was in high school, despite the fact that a lot of them are going into legal fields with a very strong scientific context. So to help fill this need, I proposed developing this curriculum to bring science to lawyers or future lawyers. And the goal was to expose these students to climate science, to science in general, really taking advantage of the active climate science community at the university. So in order to develop this curriculum, I started by looking at the science substance of what I wanted to teach. And the first decision I had to make was, to me, scientific knowledge can be broadly categorized into specific knowledge, but then also scientific literacy skills. And by specific knowledge, I mean water quality, water chemistry, those subjects with a lot of depth. In contrast, scientific literacy skills are more the broadly applicable skills that can apply to any field of science. And so to me, and looking at different definitions in the literature, and the National Research Council has science education standards, scientific literacy can be defined by a layperson who understands how science is different from other kinds of knowledge, who understands how the process of scientific inquiry is conducted, how knowledge is gained. This scientifically literate person can interpret information and data both qualitatively and quantitatively, and with critical questions in mind, and also can acquire and use information from primary sources. And so ultimately, after talking to both scientists and law professors, I decided to focus more on these literacy skills because I was afraid in the curriculum that trying to cover water quality in one 90-minute period would just leave the students with a very superficial knowledge, whereas scientific literacy skills would be more useful long-term and more akin to what law students learn anyway, very critical thinking skills. So I also reached out to law professors who I've worked with, looking at the few who teach science and law seminars. Two in particular I talked to were Wendy Wagner, who teaches at the UT Austin School of Law, and also Holly Doremus, who teaches at Berkeley, both of whom also have degrees in science. And their curricula was very helpful to look at because they focused a lot on how the law views science. So their curricula were based on how law incorporates science into each branch of government and also the legal standards for relying on science. So that was helpful to look at, and they had a lot of really great, interesting resources, and they were both really great resources. I also talked to scientists, many of you who are sitting here, about trying to understand what topics were important in a climate science context and also how best to build scientific literacy skills. And then I also looked at syllabi online, and there were a lot of climate change, climate law syllabi, but very different than what my syllabus ended up being, in that these other classes focused a lot on the legal standards for bringing climate change action. They focused a lot on institutions, focused on avenues such as the Clean Air Act and public nuisance laws to bring climate change litigation, and they've also focused on specific litigation in the United States and abroad. So here's just my process. I don't know, I had a lot of questions. You know, at first I was thinking, oh, I want to teach all these substantive topics, but again, talking to folks made me realize that that was probably not a great idea, and I also got a lot of sage advice, as in scale back my ambitions, and if I could just get law students to understand graphs, that would be great. So the outcome of this is that I'm going to be teaching next semester at the law school. Over the summer, my timeline for my project got shifted up a bit, but over the summer I've been working again with these professors and then Kirsten Engel over at the law school, and I proposed a curriculum in August, and it got approved by the curriculum committee and then by the faculty. So come spring 2015, I will be teaching integrating science and the law in practice. So the law school does a abbreviated semester because it allows law students to take the bar in February, and then after that they have an 8-week period where they have to take 10 units of classes. So this is going to be one of the classes that's offered during that time. It will be once a week, so 8 sessions once a week, 1 credit, pass-fail, limited I think to 12 students, and it'll be a combination of, I will teach some of the classes, I will have some guest lecturers who are going to come in and cover the science parts of the classes, and then it's the post-bar period really focuses on experiential activities, which I'll talk about in a minute as part of the syllabus. So the objectives for the class are that the students will learn how and where science and law interact and intersect, understand the basic science processes, gain basic scientific literacy skills, and apply these skills in a legal context, and learn the basics of climate science and law. And when I read that, it still seems very ambitious. But, so over the 8-week period, each class will be set up in terms of there'll be some readings, both from media, law review articles, science journals. I've actually found a couple of really great TED Talks. There's some good pieces in The Daily Show and the new John Oliver show about the conflict of science and public policy more than the law. So the first week we'll cover that topic. The second week, I think Judith Bronstein over in the Department of EEB is going to come talk about the hallmarks of science and scientifically generated information. So basically answering the question, why is science better than no science? The third week, Jeannie McLean is going to come talk about continue a little bit about scientific inquiry, but then also talk about public perceptions of science and how science can be used and misused. And then weeks 4 and 5, they're going to be focusing on the specific skill of looking at data, interpreting data, and learning about assumptions, looking at graphs, and how to read and understand them. And then Connie is going to come in and talk about the general global processes that drive climate, and then we'll spend a week focusing on climate change society in the Southwest, and then the final week we'll look again, wrapping everything up in the legal context, doing climate change litigation in the United States. And as I said before, the post-February, these classes have to be really focused on experiential activities, so giving students the opportunity to use science in a legal context. So Some of the activities I have planned are, for example, assuming the role of a federal judge and determining whether or not to admit expert testimony. So the Supreme Court has set out a set of rules for determining whether or not science is valid in terms of being admitted into a courtroom as an expert witness, and how that compares to the broad process of the scientific inquiry. Another experiential activity would be pretending to be a legal advisor to a member of Congress and being asked to explain a given draft and its implications for a pending piece of legislation. And then the final experiential activity I had planned was to be a federal agency scientist and to write 2 of the science-based sections of an environmental impact statement based on some articles that I'll give them. So, what are my lessons? So I learned a lot in this process. It was really interesting, it was really fun, and I'm really grateful to CLIMAS for giving me the opportunity to do this. There's a lot of interest in this topic. From the people I talked to every day in the media, you can see science has kind of become part of our cultural wars. The likely future chair of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, James Inhofe, has declared climate change to be the greatest hoax ever perpetuated on mankind. You know, a couple months ago I read an article in the New York Times about how courts are relying more and more on legal briefs for their scientific information. So it's a real issue, you know, as more and more cases become about different issues of science. I think it's really, really important. At least, it's not that I expect the law students to come out of this being scientists, but I do expect them to be able to at least have a bit of orientation and understand what questions to ask. They'll always have their experts. They'll always be able to ask other people, but I think getting to the point where you start to know what the right questions to ask are is very important. I also learned that the quality of input is better than the quantity of input. I took Connie's class in spring on science and decision making, which was really helpful, and it was something Allison Meadows said about surveying people, and it's really great. I had this idea where I wanted to survey all these professors to get a sense of the topics that I wanted, but then I realized, like, in the context of an online survey, I can't really convey what it is that I wanted to teach, and so really just getting on the phone and talking to really professors who are respected or meeting them in person and who have a lot of experience teaching science and the law, that was really helpful to me. And then for the curriculum itself, I intend to have a pre-class knowledge survey and a post-class knowledge survey to help me assess what it is that students took from the class and how I can make it better. And going forward, you know, improving scientific literacy in the judiciary is really, really important to me at all levels, whether it's law students, lawyers, judges, policymakers. And I also think the reverse is true. Improving legal literacy in the scientific community is also very important. And I definitely intend to keep pursuing this work, so I'm really grateful that CLIMAS gave me the opportunity to do it, and I'm simultaneously excited and terrified to be teaching at the law school. So these are a few of the folks who are super, super helpful. Connie was really, really helpful this whole time, and then a lot of these folks here will be teaching in the class, so I really appreciate everyone's input.